The much-anticipated 2024-2025 budget speech by the Minister of Finance, Enoch Godongwana, has finally come to pass, and to mixed reviews. One balancing act for the Minister of Finance is, in this highly contested election year, is the question of jobs, growth, and inequality. Good evening, and welcome to Unfiltered. I'm Sizwe Mpofu Walsh. Tonight we ask, did the 2024 budget speech adequately address your social concerns? And let's welcome our guests this evening. Mahfouz Rafi is an economic researcher specializing in budgeting and parliamentary oversight. We also welcome development economist Pelisa Nkomo. Remember to comment on X using our hashtag @UnfilteredSABC. Before we continue, let's take a look at how opposition parties reacted to the budget speech.
The minister would have to choose whether he's going to carry on spending unsustainably on, for example, the bloated public sector wage bill and taking the debt off from Eskom and now also from Transnet, or he can focus on the needs of the people, because there wasn't any in between. And he did a dismal job today. He really did not deliver as he should have delivered to the most vulnerable South Africans battling a cost of living crisis with 5 million children in our country that are starving today.
150 billion rand from our reserve fund at the Reserve Bank. Now that is there to buffer us in case of capital outflows, and it's to protect the Reserve Bank. And now we are seeing that is being taken for the purposes of trying to balance the books. What happens next year when again we've got a problem? Is it again going to be accessed? Is it again going to be taken?
We are in a deep crisis, and his speech and the budget actually confirms that. I think Steve now also mentioned the fact that 100 billion rand is taken from the foreign exchange and gold reserve fund. That is a government that's not planning for the future and for problems and crises that might be there in the future.
We are still saying exactly the same things that they said when President Beki, for example, was still in charge. The only thing that they are trying to get right, they try to get right because it's an elections budget. They try to talk about increasing social grants. The first tranche will come now, the next one will be after election. So they are saying if you vote for us, we'll reward you in October.
As I expected, we have had things that we knew that there is no capacity to deliver on them. To cut on NSFAS massively like that is an insult to young people of this country. To not have a plan on how we're going to grow the economy of this country, to not have a plan on how our municipalities are going to be enhanced and strengthened in terms of more budget.
The minister was very much electioneering in his budget. He, besides the nice to hear what he said, but we are very much worried about the fact that he's stepping into the reserves, which is a clear admission that they failed to ignite our economy. We can't be excited about that. As much as he has allocated some increases in different departments, but the fact of the matter is all departments are underperforming. Some are even failing to spend the allocation. We have a deficit in collection, which is a serious problem, yet government continues to actually spend, which is very much of a problem.
It's a crucial fixture on South Africa's political and economic landscape. The budget speech sets the trajectory for South Africa's fiscal year. And let's get into our conversation about that speech. I'm very glad to be joined by you, Mr. Rafi. And I suppose, what's interesting about your voice is that you know the numbers, but also look at this from a social perspective. Can we start with some of the newsy items which have made headlines? What did you make of the decision to dip into some of our contingency reserves to the tune of 250 billion, although 100 billion is going to go back to the Reserve Bank in time?
I think it's a most welcome step. It's something civil society has been calling for quite some time, actually. This is taxpayers' money, and it should be used then to service the nation and to service the people of South Africa. Of course, we do caution against using it irresponsibly, using it in ways that would increase inflation. But the government, as it has admitted, is desperate for funds, and the people of South Africa are desperate for social services. They're desperate for education, for healthcare, and any mechanisms like drawing on the Jafekra reserves to increase spending in areas where it will affect people who are most marginalized by the economic system that we're currently in is a welcome step. I think more steps like this should be encouraged. The government definitely has an array of options available to increase the amount of revenue it has to spend on especially on social services, but also on an infrastructure plan and an industrialization plan that can provide jobs and help drive this country forward and help drive the economic growth that we need.
That's quite interesting because a number of economists, maybe a minority, have said that we have been a bit too conservative in the way that we've been spending and that we should pull some of these levers which are supposedly only there for emergencies. I'm not sure what is an emergency if not the South African economy right now. What are some of those other areas where you think we could be able to find additional reserves or additional funds to fund social spending going into the future?
Look, it is a difficult act and a balancing act that requires a lot of research and a lot more risk assessments than Treasury has really done so far. But a couple of years ago, they did mention that they want to consider a wealth tax, and they had sort of invited third parties to collect tax data on that. And that is something that I think should be delivered on, especially given the rate of inequality in South Africa. There are other things. We do have a narrow tax base, but we are the most unequal country in the world, so that is to be expected. And so increases to personal income tax and other taxes on the richest sections of society is something that should be considered in more depth and more detail. We also welcome the move to have introduced and implement a global tax minimum of 15% on corporate taxes. But the Treasury estimates that this will capture about 8 billion of illicit financial flows, when other estimates suggest that up to 400 billion rand in illicit financial flows leave the country each year. So this is something that should be considered and researched in more depth in how we can capture these funds.
Absolutely. I mean, at the beginning of the speech, as usual, the Minister started with South Africa's economic outlook. And before we dive deeper into the budget, I suppose it is worth just taking a step back and appreciating the outlook. I mean, on the one hand, we've got a national development plan which has lofty goals for our growth targets. And yet we hear in this recent budget speech, we're not even getting up to 1% growth. We're talking in the 0.6 and 0.8 region. And we're talking about, maybe just over 1% growth by 2026. This is quite a sorry indictment on the state of South Africa's economy, isn't it? If we're falling so short of the targets that government has set for itself.
Yes, undoubtedly, it really is. And I think the worrying thing is that the budget doesn't really introduce mechanisms to encourage economic growth. And this is also something that is necessary, especially in times of crisis that we are, times of economic hardship. Cutting funds to social spending, but also to infrastructure, is a serious cause of concern, because these are sort of levers that you want to use to encourage economic growth. I think there's other mechanisms, such as using other public corporations like the Industrial Development Corporation and using public funds. Perhaps the AIDC has done some reporting on government employees' pension funds, and using that in a way that services the people, because this is public money, this is people's money, and trying to use that for a real consolidated industrial development plan is something that should be considered in more detail and in more depth. And we need the government with the political will to carry that out, so that there's a state-led development in service of the people. And an industrial plan should include social spending on things like housing, things like education infrastructure, which there's far too little of at the moment. But investing in education and investing in people's healthcare and investing in people's housing will have economic effects, not only on jobs created in the immediate term, but also being able to redistribute the economy and make it so that people are more able to access work and to contribute to the economy.
Absolutely. I think you're getting quite a few notifications, Mr. Rafi. So if it's possible for you to mute those, they may be coming from Treasury. We don't know. But if we could just ask you to mute those. Absolutely. It's an interesting point you raise. Let's go into the budget itself, because the speech then unfolded onto the question of state-owned enterprises. And of course, Eskom and Transnet took center stage because of their centrality to the economy, but also to the budget. What did you make on some of the statements that were made around state-owned entities, and particularly the debt burden of Eskom and indeed the nature of Transnet and its impact on the budget?
Look, so yeah, the Eskom was granted some debt relief last year, and then this year no additional debt relief was given to Eskom. Although one thing that did happen was that some of the conditions which were attached to previous debt relief was no longer granted. I think one thing that is important to note also in last year's decision to relieve Eskom's debt, it came from essentially treasury bonds and added to the fiscus's debt burden. And so I mentioned the AIDC report earlier, and they provide an interesting suggestion that as an alternative way to finance Eskom's debt would be to draw on the government employees pension fund. And I think this makes sense given that Eskom is a government-owned entity, and that there'd be expected returns if this is spent correctly. But more immediately, it would free up funds for the government to spend on its other programs as well. So debt relief attached to different financial mechanisms is something that is necessary in driving the economy forward. We know the effects that load shedding has had on this country, and so we know some of the problems associated with it. Transnet also again wasn't really issued a immediate debt relief, but there were guarantees offered to Transnet's debt. It remains to be seen whether Transnet meets the conditions, and we are also concerned these conditions are not completely transparent, whether it might lead to unbundling and privatization of Transnet, which in the long term could have serious effects on the sustainability of growth in our country and how that is distributed and generated. So it's something that we call for more transparency on, and something that we need to consider when the debt is guaranteed from the public purse and when we are funding the recovery of these vital SOEs.
We're about to run to a break, but could I just get your reaction to an interview that the minister did on this channel, where he said that Eskom seems to be something of a headache for Treasury because of the fact that despite these guarantees that they're given or this debt relief that they've been given, they're actually not meeting the conditions, resulting in 2 billion having to actually go back to Treasury. One wonders whether the problem is actually a money problem, as he put it, or whether there's some kind of deeper management problem in Eskom that isn't just about getting more money or more debt relief.
Look, undoubtedly, there's a range of different problems at Eskom, and I think you probably had shows entirely devoted to that. What I will say is that we need clearer signals that against this drive towards privatization of Eskom, because that in itself is extremely dangerous in terms of redress and equity and expanding access to electricity for this country, which is so necessary. And also in terms of ensuring that the way the economy is structured is not increasingly in service of an elite minority as it currently is, but it's restructured so that everybody can benefit.
Right.
Let's
leave it there. We will come back after the break to expand further on that point. Thank you very much for the insight so far. The budget speech recently was held, and today we're looking into the speech, looking at it from multiple angles, seeing whether it was the correct balance between our developmental needs and our fiscal constraints. Stick with us as we delve further into the speech after the break. Welcome back to Unfiltered. Tonight we are exploring the budget speech and its delicate balance between South Africa's very important structural constraints, but also the key drivers like poverty, inequality, and unemployment that lie behind where we place our rands and cents. Let's take a look at what the minister said in his speech, and we'll come back to our panel.
Our challenge, honourable members, is that the size of the pie is not growing fast enough to meet our developmental needs. As such, our fiscal strategy to support economic growth, reduce risks to the economy while ensuring fiscal sustainability. Compared to a year ago, the budget deficit for 2023-24 is estimated to worsen from 4% to 4.9% of GDP. The higher budget deficit means that debt service costs in 2023-24 have been revised higher by 15.7 billion to 356 billion. Debt service costs will absorb more than 20% of revenue. To put this into perspective, spending on debt service costs is greater than the respective budgets of social protection, health, or peace and security. For this reason, honourable members, we are strengthening our strategy and sticking to our fiscal goals. A net reduction of 80.6 billion in non-interest expenditure is being implemented over the medium term. At the same time, revenue has been revised up by 45.6 billion over the medium term relative to the medium-term budget policy statement. And we have taken the decision to introduce a reform of the gold and foreign exchange contingency reserve account, also known as GFECRA.
Ms. Nkomo, can I bring you in this segment? Thank you very much for joining us and welcome. Before we left for the break, we were talking about the overall economic environment, but also the question of debt servicing costs. I mean, over the last 5 to 10 years, these debt servicing costs seem to be spiraling ever quicker out of control, and we're taking ever further emergency measures to limit the damage. Do you think this is an indictment on where we are and where our economy is, that we are really scrambling to service debt costs at this point, but we don't necessarily have the developmental successes which usually go along with major fiscal spending, and it's actually being diverted into servicing debt?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, one of the key things that we need to recognize is that, by the way, our debt service costs are not really outside of other emerging economies. So they're actually in par. In fact, on average, the current percentage is about 69%, and we're actually at 76%. So we're not very far. I think that's the first thing. But I think the biggest indictment for me and even the rest of the civil society organizations is the fact that, firstly, our borrowing costs are higher, but also, even though our borrowing costs are higher, we don't use the money that we raise from financial markets and redeploy in productive resources of the economy. For instance, if you look at the spending in terms of the capital formation, it's been on the negative at negative 14.6%. If you look at the medium-term budget statement of last year, October, even this one. So what that means is that we must ask the question: what have we been doing with regards to the money that we raise? That's a second. I think the third issue is that it's the bigger growth crisis we're confronted with now. Had we been using some of the funds that we raise from the capital markets, we would not be sitting with this growth crisis. And so, and as such, the Minister of Finance is therefore compelled to introduce fiscal consolidation as the only instrument, right, to manage fiscal stability, which is quite problematic because one of the key things, by the way, about macroeconomic policy is actually so rich in as far as the different instruments that you need to use to make sure that there's fiscal stability. But in the back of fiscal stability, you then need two other instruments around supply side interventions and as well demand side interventions. You know, I just came out of an interesting debate now where the SARS commissioner was actually raising a concern about our ability to raise revenue through taxation. And he's saying that part of the reason why it declined is because we're not raising sufficient taxes. And that's fair because we are having millions and millions of people who are currently unemployed who then rely on social security wage for them to sustain their families.
Indeed. Let me put some of what you've said to Mr. Rafi, and what are your thoughts around Ms. Nkomo's view on where we are with debt servicing costs? I mean, she makes an interesting and important point that, I mean, different economies have different debt to GDP ratios, and we know that countries like Japan have over 100%, but that's usually because they're spending on something tangible that is good for the society, like education or healthcare or social spending, whereas we don't see the growth that goes along with this increasing debt cost. It seems to be a lag on our economy that's growing without the attendant benefits that you would expect if these debt costs were rising.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to highlight that there is a good debt and there's bad debt. And you don't want to be spending on things that you won't be able to realize benefits from in the future and will hamper your ability to repay this debt. But I think, I definitely agree with the previous speaker that perhaps our debt problem isn't as dire as it's often made out to be. And if we look at the composition of our debt, you'd see that there's significant buffers that we have in or alleviating factors. For example, most of our debt is sort of domestically backed. A lot of it is in some ways or shapes or forms owed to ourselves as well, and owed to the public. And we don't have significant risk in terms of the amount of foreign debt that we have. And more risk comes with foreign debt because of things like we'll be vulnerable to fluctuating exchange rates and interest rates in that economy, for example. So as a whole, while our debt to GDP ratio is high, it's not extremely high compared to other developing countries, and it's also not in risk of default, far from risk of default. So we have that, but there is the important need to make sure that it's being spent in the right way and it's spent in ways that will realize returns. And I think it's important therein to highlight that not enough money is being spent on education for the past. I think since 2018, per spending learner in basic education has been going down in real terms. And that's a serious concern, because what you want to do is you want to use the public money and public spending to finance the growth of this future. Likewise, the recent cuts to the national to NSFAS is very concerning, because these are ideally investments in a skilled and educated workforce that would help propel us in the future, but that's not happening. Again, I highlighted this earlier. Centralized and coherent industrial development plan that works on social services and economic growth is something that we should be investing on to ensure that the debt that we do take out and the debt that we currently have will be fruitful and not be fruitless and wasted expenditure.
Right. Let me bring in Ms. Nkomo then again on that to come to some of the areas of social spending in our budget, Ms. Nkomo, and what are your thoughts on the way we are dividing the pie? We know that the pie is not growing, but are we dividing the pie correctly in terms of our social spending, particularly when it comes to the questions of education and and healthcare and social security. What are your thoughts on the balance we're striking there and whether it's the right one?
Yeah, I think we're struggling with the balance. In fact, I think one of the things about this speech has been that it had to satisfy investors a lot more. I think it had to quell, the corridor conversations global about where South Africa is going to. So, for instance, if you look at the amount of money that is still given to state-owned enterprises, in fact, we actually learned that, between 2005 and to date, we had given 500 billion to state-owned enterprises. And state-owned enterprises are actually supposed to be contributing and actually giving dividends to government to be able to so the government is able to increase its revenue. But I also know that, I think without really going too far, I know that state-owned enterprises have gone through a corporatization program, which among the key things they were meant to do was to raise their own capital, but also be able to run robust and dynamic businesses. But instead, they've really been actually taking from the very same fiscals they're meant to be contributing to. So that's one thing. But of course, there's a component where there's a highlight around investment in rail, for instance, which I think at face value, what the minister had said, that they're going to invest in TRASA and make it sure that they increase, access to transport, but also obviously the multiplier effect is that it means that the rail infrastructure is actually going to be, there's going to be development of rail infrastructure. Yeah. So the multiplier effect of that is going to be job creation. Absolutely. But let me come back into the social component quickly, Susan.
Sure.
If you look at, for example, the allocation of early childhood development, is that a child is allocated 17 rands. According to Census 2022 that came out, is that South Africa has not been able to draw what we call social dividend and economic dividend from the amount of resources we spend on education. So it also means that, and only 12% of the children in the last 15 years that have been through the education system that are able to actually enroll for post-matric education.
Right.
So that actually signals that the foundation of our education system is actually fairly weak, but also we're celebrating matric results instead of investing in the foundational program so that in the future we're not confronted with the current growth crisis. So the spending,
right.
disequilibrium in the spending, in summary.
Right. Let me put that to Mahfouz Rafi. We are going to go to a break soon after this, so you can expand more there. But I know one of your areas of expertise is education, and what you said earlier was you think we're actually still not spending enough, although we do seem to be spending a huge proportion of the budget on education. Is more money the problem? Or again, similar to ESCOM, is there a danger of putting more money into the system when we're not getting the right returns from it as we speak? Or where would you put that money, that additional money?
Look, it does seem like a lot of money. 324 billion rand is a huge chunk of national spending. But if you look at the scale of the problem of education we're facing in South Africa, it really isn't enough. 728 schools are still dependent entirely on pit toilets, which are illegal and which were supposed to be eradicated by law in 2013, and then 2016. The deadline was later moved to 2020, 2023. So there is one, and departments have consistently said this, that there's not enough funds for them to eradicate these backlogs. And two is that there's enormous backlogs. And so the other worry is that in real terms, again, once you factor into account inflation and increased learner enrollment as well, education, the chunk of money going towards education isn't increasing at a high enough level to address massive infrastructure backlogs, not only toilets, but also libraries, also science labs, also sports fields, also safe perimeter fencing, enough classrooms. There's a shortage of at least 70,000 classrooms across the country. So these are things that unfortunately do require money and a lot of spending. But I think if given the appropriate amount of money, then we would definitely see returns on them.
Right.
I think I must also highlight...
let's leave it there for now. We will come back after the break and allow you to expand on this question of education. And then after the break, we'll also look at social security and South Africa's grant-making system and some of the announcements that were made in that regard. Stick with us on Unfiltered. We'll be back after this. Welcome back to Unfiltered. The budget is where the rubber hits the road in terms of governance. It's where the money that's desperately needed for social services to alleviate poverty, inequality, and maybe even make a dent on unemployment gets deployed. And tonight we're exploring that budget in light of Minister Godongwana's recent budget speech. Mahfouz Rafi, before we went to the break, you were just rounding off the point that we were discussing around education and that segment of the budget, and you were making the case that despite the fact that we spend a lot, when we look at how much we still need to do in terms of infrastructure and classrooms, we should actually be doing even more.
Yes, indeed. So Treasury's austerity, their fiscal consolidation has had a massive detrimental impact on education in this country. This most recent budget tabled significant reductions to the school infrastructure spending. Two of the most important grants that are given to spend on infrastructure include the Education Infrastructure Grant and the School Infrastructure Backlogs Grant. Both of these have been hit by massive reductions to the tune of 611 billion rand for the Education Infrastructure Grant and 1.2 billion rand for the School Infrastructure Backlogs Grant over the medium term. And so we're really never going to be able to address the massive backlogs that we have in providing proper infrastructure so that learners can go to schools in safe environments and not be in overcrowded classrooms. They can have enough desks and chairs and enough students per teacher. If we continue with this trajectory of cutting spending in real terms to education, I think one thing also to worry about is that although there were provisions made to augment the wage bill that was agreement that was included last year, there's not really any sign of increased spending to employ more teachers, and in fact, funding that was used to support NSFAS and to support bursary programs that would support future teachers has also been cut. And so we're heading towards a situation where education is only going to get worse because education funding is going down, both in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of investing into the quality of education and the amount of teachers that are provided to learners. And this is a massive problem, especially in urban areas like Gauteng and Western Cape, where there's in-migration. There's a huge shortage of teachers and there's massive overcrowding, and this isn't being addressed by the budget. And one thing it's important to highlight is that spending now in education is an investment in the future. When you spend now and people get the adequate nutrition through the nutrition program, when you spend on early childhood development to avoid childhood stunting and to allow them to be stimulated at a young age, you reap these rewards in the future, and unfortunately not enough money is going towards these sorts of programs that will have returns later on.
Right. Ms. Nkomo, what do you make of that suggestion, and what are your thoughts on education, particularly within the budget?
Well, I mean, in fact, education, if you look at the budget, they've had a budget cuts of about between 40 to 56 billion. So the education sector is actually going to be badly affected. But there's a question that you asked though earlier, whether actually financing of funding for education is really the question, or what other instruments that should be built into the system to make it show that we actually improve our educational outcomes. Of course, financing is going to be important because if the foundational program is not well supported, meaning that children are still studying within mud houses. That's the first thing. But if there's no proper infrastructure, even where there's a proper infrastructure, it's incomplete. There are no science labs. There are no recreational facilities for children. In the last 30 years, the government is actually between 20 to 30,000 schools. But almost 60-70% of those schools have no recreational facilities. So meaning that once schooling period is over, the infrastructure, the schooling, which is meant to be social infrastructure, gets locked up. There are no other activities. And I do think, and I think it speaks fundamentally to the fact that our focus is just so linear when we think about education, but we don't think about other different things. But let me even come back to the social grants issue, for instance. So there are three things there. Is that currently the social child support grant is below the poverty line, which is poverty line in terms of the, which is about 1,681. That's the first thing. The second thing is that even if you look at the foster grant, it's below the inflation adjusted rate. That's the second issue. The third issue is that there's been a tightening of a means testing system, which is likely to exclude a lot of people who are currently qualifying for social grant. There's a fourth issue I just want to, on a light note. There are young people in the Eastern Cape that have coined a song that says President Ramaphosa doesn't want us to get jobs, but instead he would prefer that we actually get grants. Now, that's a younger generation of people who are actually saying, here we are, we're an underutilized labor, both for rural development, to help in the food security sector or in food production sector. We are actually underutilized. There's absolutely no resources that are allocated for that component of youth. And as a result, you see in South Africa becoming more urbanized. We're sitting probably now between 55% people are confronted in urban areas, confronted with urban poverty, while 35% are in rural areas. And some of the people in rural areas are actually aging, so they won't be able to produce food. But where I'm making a link with this conversation is that it's important that when we use the budget or the resource allocation as an instrument for redistributive mechanisms, I do not think that we can use social grants as an only mechanism to transform, but also to integrate people who have actually the history of being economically excluded in the economy. Right. And the risk that we have now.
Indeed. Let me put that, since you've taken us very neatly to the question of the social security system, back to our other guest and ask whether you think or what you make of the current basket of social grants that are offered and what was announced. There was also, and just to build on Ms. Nkomo's focus on the grant system, the grant that was introduced during COVID will apparently continue, but we still need some details, and we don't know exactly what those details are yet, so we didn't get those details in the budget speech. So just your thoughts on that theme.
Oh, yeah, it is quite unfortunate the 350 Rand social relief of distress grants was announced to include to be funded for another year, but the Treasury didn't commit to funding it beyond the next election cycle, and so we are unsure exactly on how it will be funded in the future. The other big problem with the way that the SRD grant is being funded, besides for its remaining particularly low at 350 Rand, is that Treasury is not budgeting to cover the full amount of people who qualify for that grant. So around 16 million people in South Africa live under the food poverty line, but Treasury is only budgeting to cover for around 8 million people under the grant. And I think what's been happening over previous years, because Treasury says, no, we've been underspending on this grant, and that's why we're reducing the budget. But what's been happening is that they've been making the eligibility criteria, the way people can access the grant, increasingly difficult to access and increasingly more bureaucratic and excluding people for really sometimes quite arbitrary reasons. There is one case raised by an activist group where the lady had like two. She has a name and a middle name, and she just didn't include the middle name in her application or something like that, and was therefore removed of accessing this 350 rand grant, which is really a lifeline for millions of people who are indigent in South Africa. The other worry about sort of the grants is that the permanent grants like the child support grant and the old age grant, they were given increases more or less in line with general inflation, but inflation for necessary items like electricity and food has been growing at a rate much higher than other costs. I think electricity inflation last year was 11% and food inflation was 12%.
That's such an important point just to say, because we just get the number, of it's increased by this many hundred, but that really needs to be put in the context of how much costs are increasing. Yeah, essentially people who are receiving the grants are getting poorer in real terms if they're being, if you're spending it on basic necessities like food and electricity, you don't have enough to cover your funds, and it's already at a rate below the poverty line, the child support grant that is, and the SRD grant as well. Indeed. So you're not even covering your nutritional aspects, and now when prices increase, grant is not being increased by even as much. So you're really being left in a situation of extreme precarity. Absolutely. And let's again leave it there for now. We're going to come back for our final segment after the break, and we'll let you and as well as Ms. Nkomo conclude their thoughts. We're discussing the budget, and we'll be back after this break to reflect on what was good about the budget, what's going right, and also where we go in the future. Stick with us. Welcome back to Unfiltered. Well, we've had the State of the Nation, we've had the budget speech, and tonight we are delving into the budget speech because of its importance for South Africa's economy and indeed its politics. And in this final segment, we promised before we went to the break that we'd first take a look at what's going well. Ms. Nkomo, of course, we in the media and as analysts are often critical and finding loopholes, which is our job, but was there anything in the budget that you welcomed and that you thought was a particular step forward?
Well, I think the withdrawal from the contingency funds was a step forward. Obviously, we find it quite problematic that is being channeled to debt payment for two reasons. The first one is that we had 140 billion windfall in the last financial year, which was channeled to debt service. Between that period and now, we've had 3.3% increase in youth unemployment. So what does it mean? It actually means that we can't then continue to use the very same strategy when we are actually drawing additional resources. That's the issue. Of course, I think the other issue, the fact that the rail infrastructure, which is a public employment program, and I think one of the key things we've really been calling for as head of economics, it's around the need to turn this country into a construction site where in fact you refurbish existing infrastructure, you build new roads, etc., so that you increase capital inflows in communities and households, but also, in fact, in the long term, you're likely to deal with the issue of revenue generation. And one of the key things that is quite problematic about how the National Treasury allocated resources is that it's using the same strategy for the last 30 years. I've not seen any other economy that is actually so rigid in how it applies its own macroeconomic policy, and the fact that, in fact, now, on the back of 1.6 GDP growth projection, we come from zero budgeting, but also now on fiscal consolidation as the only instrument to drive economic growth. But of course, if I'm an investor, the sentiments are quite positive. But I'm a South African, and as a black woman, we have 48% of unemployed, some of them rely on the very social security system. And for me, I do think that The minister, everyone, other people are saying it was balanced, but I do think that when you're confronted with multiple crises that you have, we don't need this type of budget speech, but we need something completely different.
Mahfouz Rafi, what are your thoughts on what went well in the budget speech?
Yeah, look, Caesar, I'm also reluctant to commend the budget speech when it really does not necessarily deserve it. Like I said at the beginning of the show, it is fundamentally still, even though there have been some spending increases, it's fundamentally still an austerity budget. There's still plans to reduce public expenditure over the next 3 years, and the social wage is still going to be decreasing in real terms once you account for inflation.
Right.
We do welcome the increased spending from the GFECRA as well. And even other things that could be commended, it has to be taken with a grain of salt, given that for two reasons. I think the one is that it's an election year, and the other is that some of these gains that are being presented now are really just things that were taken away during last year's medium-term budget policy statement. So things like cuts, for example, like the education infrastructure grant, it appears to be growing, but really it was just given a massive cut in November, and it's not even recovered to February 2023 levels.
Right. Well, let it not be said that I didn't try to find the silver lining. Let me having said that, let me just take some social media comments, and then I'll ask both of my guests this evening to just give us their final concluding thoughts in a minute or so. And we have Mzuvukile, who says, every year there is budget address, but every year we see here in the news about the deserving students who don't get funding from NSFAS. There are mud schools, there are deserving children who are not getting social grants. Let's take one more comment, and this is Musia, who says, employee taxes did not change. We will still be taxed as we were from March 2024 to Feb 2025, same as March 23 to Feb 24. This has been making ourselves miserable, and the worst part is that the governing party is looting it. Hashtag unfiltered. Right. Ms. Nkomo, unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I wonder what your final thoughts are in a minute or so that you'd like to conclude on.
Let me say this. I just want South Africans to know that the increased withdrawal of social grants is due to both structural and growth crisis. So what social grants have really been doing indirectly is to subsidize the failure of the economy to introduce structural changes to make it sure that it actually absorbs so many people. To date, less than 3% of Black people who are participating in the supply chain of the private sector. To date, we have had so much increase in terms of imports in this country. Our industrial capacity has declined to 19%, so meaning that almost 19% of the things that we consume are produced domestically, and the rest of other 81% are produced outside. And all we do is that we just become consuming economy, and we're assembling the economy.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us. Mahfouz Rafi, a minute or so, anything that you'd like to conclude on?
Yes, I just want to, again, highlight my disappointment with the austerity budget and the continuing policy of austerity that's clearly not working in the interests of the country and clearly excluding and oppressing further the marginalized deliberately in this country. And really, if we want to address the problems of poverty, of inequality, and of unemployment, we need to consider a different fiscal strategy, monetary strategy to this in this country, and that includes funding, massive funding increases to protect socioeconomic rights like basic education, but also a clear plan to industrialize the economy and bring jobs to all.
Thank you so much for joining us, to both of my panelists this evening. Thank you for joining us on the budget for another installment of Unfiltered News, Unfiltered Views, and Unfiltered Conversations. Have a good night.